Hello everyone and welcome to our campaigner launch of 0 Hour's new report, Net Zero, the Ambition Gap. So this is a report that's a really comprehensive, concise and easy read summary about why, despite a lot of the great work that's going on, the government's strategy is still falling short. So it's the only report which sets out clearly the connection between nature and climate and explains why we'll overshoot 1.5 degrees unless urgent measures are implemented to reverse damage to the natural world. So basically it's all about why the UK is off track and what we can do about it. So we'll be hearing from two of the co-authors of the report this evening. But obviously it's been a huge collaborative effort and the ambition gap has been peer reviewed as well by world leading experts in climate and nature. So we're really thrilled to have you all here this evening. Such good turnout. My name is Amy McDonnell. I'm the director of 0 Hour. And before I introduce you to today's speakers, I'll just quickly go through how this event will run and mention a few bits of housekeeping as well. So we're being recorded today and we can send around this recording as well if you want to go over and review this evening's session. I think you can only remain on mute, but if you can unmute, please don't. Keep cameras off, that would be really kind. And also if you could rename yourself to your name and also your constituency, so i.e. Maria Smith, Westminster, that would be fantastic so we can keep a track of who's here. So tonight's event will last for an hour. Like I said, we'll hear from both of the co-authors of the report for around about 10 to 15 minutes each. I'll round up this section and then we'll have just under 30 minutes for questions. So do post all your questions in the chat along with your name. And one of our team, Amy Healy, will pick these up. So don't hold back. Start as soon as you'd like to and keep putting the questions in the chat and we'll pick them up for you. Great, so let's get going. I'm just going to introduce the other speakers and people from the team who you'll be hearing from this evening. So I'm not sure if we can get the others on the screen. Fantastic, here we all are. So first off, I will introduce Oliver Sidorczuk, who is 0 Hour's campaign manager. He'll be reading out your questions in the second half of this evening's event. So I thought you should know who he is, of course. And we're also really incredibly grateful that we can be joined this evening by Dr. Nathalie Pettorelli. Nathalie, as well as Professor Andrew Watson, has written an introduction to the Ambition Gap report, which we'll be incorporating in, and she's here to help answer any of your questions alongside our speakers. Dr. Nathalie Pettorelli is a Senior Research Fellow at the Zoological Society of London and is co-chair of the International Union for Conservation of Nature in the Rewilding Working Group. Her research is about assessing and predicting the impacts of global environmental change on biodiversity and ecosystem services with a particular focus on climate change. So now our two speakers, we will be hearing from Jane King, who's co-author, like I said, of the report. She's one of 0 Hour's senior researchers. She has 12 years of experience working directly with world-leading scientists to help communicate their research. She specialises in food system and land use and the impact that we're having on nature. But first of all, we'll be hearing from Simon Oldridge, our other co-author of the report and another senior researcher from 0 Hour. Simon is a former business consultant who draws on his experience in simplifying complex business systems to help communicate with the public on the climate and nature crisis. So Simon, take it away.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to everyone for going to the trouble of joining us today. It's been quite a journey putting this report together and for myself and Jane, and we're really pleased to see it completed. We hope it makes the key science arguments more accessible for politicians and campaigners. In the interest of brevity, I'll keep detail to a minimum. So it's a sort of signposting exercise and you can download the report for more info. Last October, the government published its net zero strategy. And before I get into our critique, we do applaud them for being really frank about the risks we face. Above 1.5 degrees, we risk reaching climatic tipping points, meaning we could lose control of our climate for good. We also acknowledge that the UK has come a long way and we're further ahead in our aims than many nations. But we see our role as focusing on the gaps that need addressing because physics doesn't give prizes for effort. It's a tough baton for politicians to be holding right now, but simply doing more than before isn't enough. Unless we do what the scientists say is necessary, we're in deep trouble. So why did we write this report? Well, the IPCC called for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Now that describes a wartime footing, but you only have to look around where you live and it's largely business as usual. So we set out to explain how the net zero strategy falls short, how there's too much deferring and not enough action now. We explain how climate and nature are completely interwoven and why the net zero strategy doesn't offer the transformative policies needed. We set out the science on why many of the technical solutions that have been offered won't work within the time frame, how the strategy largely ignores our global footprint and why that matters. You'll have seen the recent High Court ruling on the illegality of the strategy, which we hope the government will resolve quickly. But then more than anything, we're missing this huge opportunity. There are numerous studies showing the enormous savings to be made if we act faster. But as well as financial gain, we'll explain how this, following the science advice, will help us save our rivers, clean our air, end the suffering that comes with cold, damp homes, boost jobs, relieve the burden on the NHS, and more. We aim for this to be a resource for politicians, media, and campaigners. This graphic explains the focus of our report. It shows the UK's 5 yearly carbon budgets, which you can see in blue there, our climate targets. You'll probably know that emissions rose last year by almost 5%, and the Climate Change Committee are warning that we're heading dangerously off track from these targets, which is the top line. The CCC are doing a fantastic job highlighting this delivery gap, but no one's really talking about the ambition gap. That's what this report's about. We explain why, even if we get back on track to the carbon budgets, it'll be far from sufficient for 1.5 degrees. We've spoken with lots of scientists and we're confident that we can still achieve this green line, but it does mean waking up and acting now. 0 Hour we're very focused on driving home the point, too often overlooked, that climate and nature are inextricably linked. Climate change damages nature, and at the same time, biodiversity loss amps up climate change, degrading nature's capacity to absorb and store carbon. The net zero strategy does recognise the importance of nature and the need for land use change, but it doesn't offer the transformative policies needed to make a real impact. And it misses the opportunity to harness the power of nature to tackle the climate crisis. So this presentation is divided into 2 sections following our report. I'll be doing the first, then I'll pass to Jane. So firstly, emissions reduction, talking about adequacy of our targets, controversial negative emissions technologies, other greenhouse gases, particularly methane, which needs far more attention, alternative fuels like hydrogen, which risk sending us down the wrong path and making things worse and wasting money, and then energy use and what we're doing, well, or not doing about demand for energy. But first, a quick explainer on net zero dates and carbon budgets. Warming is driven by cumulative emissions. So it's the path we take, not when we get there, that matters. This is the sort of shape of the reduction curve called for by the IPCC, looking at a global picture. And this is the broad concept being followed by most developed nations, putting things off till tomorrow, not doing very much today. So the concept we need to get across to politicians is that it's not the net zero date that matters. You can see in example 2 here that with the same net zero date, we can have twice the emissions and twice the warming. So firstly, targets. These are our carbon budgets, our climate targets, and they're out of date. The 4th and the 5th predate the UK's net zero by 2050 commitment and the IPCC's report setting out how important the 1.5 degree threshold is. The 4th budget that we're entering now is 11 years old. It's not fit for purpose. And the whole plan was devised with just a 50% chance of success. They linked into the 50% likely model that the IPCC produced. We don't think that's good enough. We also, from these budgets, they exclude international aviation and shipping until 2033. But again, that's no longer good enough. These emissions are real and they're causing climate change. Now, the Climate Change Committee says these targets are 1.5 degree compliant, but they make the unrealistic assumption that the rest of the world will reduce emissions at our pace. And that ignores population growth and the fact that poorer nations are climbing out of poverty, so living standards are increasing, and their emissions will increase for a while. All that means developed nations, richer nations who are invariably responsible for the problem, well, largely, have to cut faster. And then the fifth carbon budget was not updated for our 2030 Paris commitment to reduce emissions by 68% by 2030. And even if we work to our budget, it will see us overshoot that international commitment by 36%. And then the elephant in the room, we have no targets to reduce our imported emissions. And as the largest net emitter of, as the largest net importer of CO2 per capita in the G7, that's a real issue. Last year, there was much in the press about being halfway to net zero. You can see that chart rolled forward a little bit now, shows that a 44% reduction in our territorial emissions. But when we add the emissions caused by the goods we import, the reduction in our total footprint is only 18%. That's since 1990, that's well under 1% a year. And that's what I call incremental change, not transformational change that we need. All of which means that we UK citizens will be emitting on average more than twice our share of the global carbon budget for staying within 1.5 degrees. Dividing that budget by the world population works out to about 50 tons each, just under. And so you can see where we're looking at well over double there. And of course, that average hides a large variance, with the top 1% emitting more than their 49 tons allowance in just 1 year, according to Oxfam. Negative emissions technologies. I want to emphasize just how much reliance our strategy places on technologies for CO2 removal. These are the Climate Change Committee's pathways to 2050 for each sector, mostly coming to zero, some continuing. And then we have CO2 removals as that dotted negative line. And you can see with the little circle there that by 2050, our current plans rely on technical removals of CO2 from the atmosphere, reaching the same scale as today's entire manufacturing and construction sector, over around 60 million tons a year to be removed. We have the allure of future removals distracting from the need to cut emissions now. But more than that, there are fundamental problems with the technologies offered. There are two main technologies here. We've got bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture with carbon storage. BECCS builds on the Drax bioenergy plant in North Yorkshire. And our report sets out numerous show-stopping problems, which mean BECCS absolutely cannot deliver on its claims. Plus, it will wreak terrible damage on nature and hit food security. All this is linked in our report to respected peer-reviewed science. DAX is a high-energy process where CO2 is sucked out of the air and pumped deep underground and bonded to rock. Simple logic tells you, though, that if you try and deploy that at scale before you have surplus clean power, you'll simply burn more gas. What you remove here with DAX will simply be put back into the atmosphere with gas power stations cycling on to power the DAX plant. Now, DAX is very likely to have a future role in bringing atmospheric carbon back to safer levels, but not this side of net zero. It must not be used to justify ongoing emissions. And in the plans, it is. We have so much loaded into our plan that we'd have to build up to 5 plants every week between about a year ago and 2050. Clearly not, realistic. Other greenhouse gases. The UK currently bundles these gases like methane and nitrous oxide together with CO2 to form an equivalent number, and in a way that underestimates their impact. As a result, these highly potent warming gases aren't getting the focus they should. Methane of these is the most significant, actually responsible for around 0.5 degrees of the 1.2 degrees of warming we've seen to date. So it's really significant. There's some very worrying science recently on why concentrations in the atmosphere are accelerating sharply when they should have fallen with COVID. And we really have to take methane far more seriously. But there's also an opportunity. Because methane is short-lived in the atmosphere, a 45% cut by 2030 would shave around 0.3 degrees off warming, and that's hugely significant and could keep us clear of tipping points. So on to alternative fuels, and one of the key fuels here is hydrogen. This burns cleanly in pure oxygen, but in air it causes dangerous pollution, and it's also more expensive for heating by quite a way than heat pumps. So it's just not a solution for home heating or car transport. And we seem to be heading down that route a little bit. Green hydrogen has some exciting potential, but it's very inefficient to produce. Supplies will be limited and expensive, so it must be reserved for difficult to decarbonize sectors like shipping industry, etc. Blue hydrogen, now, when companies talk about green hydrogen, it's often a fig leaf for blue hydrogen made from methane. There will hardly be any green hydrogen available, so blue hydrogen is what will be used. And that opens up the door to significantly worsening our situation with methane emissions. Blue hydrogen, because of its derivation from methane, can be worse than coal for the climate. Then we have so-called sustainable aircraft fuels. This is a real case in point as to why we must tackle climate and nature together. It's hard to think of a worse idea. Vast areas of monocrops, leaving no room for nature or people, and at a time when we desperately need to improve food security. So we really must ensure we don't go down this dangerous route. Which takes us neatly on to demand. What's quite absent in the net zero strategy is action on using less energy. We waste so much energy unnecessarily in this country. A collaboration between Oxford and Leeds University has shown that we could cut demand by over 50% with no detrimental impact on quality of life. In fact, we'd make things better. This graphic shows an analysis of heat loss over 5 hours from a well-known supplier of heating control. So it's huge data. And it shows UK homes are the worst insulated in Europe, thanks to terrible building codes. We can also see, when you look at Scandinavia, how well things can be done. So the net zero strategy offers little on this front. The heat pump grant is only funded for 90,000 homes over 3 years, at which rate it would take 800 years for 25 million homes to be retrofit. And it only pays up to £6,000, which is just not enough for a widespread take-up of heat pumps, which cost, significantly more than that. The eco insulation grant of £1,000 would have to be far higher to kickstart the market, which is a shame because this is the cheapest way to get big savings. It's the fastest way to decarbonize, is saving on insulation. And it can be done. Italy is paying up to 110% of the cost to decarbonize your home, up to €100,000, and that gets the market going. And we're building far too many homes, particularly when an estimated 1.2 million lie empty. A new UK home is typically responsible for around 50 tons of carbon emissions. And as I showed you before with that graphic earlier, that's roughly one person's entire allowance for that lifetime allowance. We also need the builders for retrofit work. An important study has shown that on our current path, housing alone will use up 48% of the UK's carbon budget, which will clearly cause us to blow it. And then on transport, we're stalling, with no incentives to reduce car journeys, large gas guzzlers proliferating. We're moving in the wrong direction on aviation and roads. You can see from this chart of emissions by sector that we're flatlining on buildings and transport. Achieving change here will mean briefing the public on the climate crisis, explaining why changes are necessary, and it will need funding. And finally, we're still incentivizing the wrong things, with 10 billion every year in taxpayer money supporting fossil fuels. This is an independent assessment from the OECD. The recent windfall tax includes a rebate where 91p is handed back for every £1 invested. by oil companies. Now, you'd think that rebate would be for investment in clean power, encouraging the green transition, but it's not. It's only for fossil fuels. The thinking's all wrong here. But looking at it positively, there's a big pot of money here that could be redirected into accelerating the green transition. So that's all on emissions, half the picture, and I'll now hand over to my colleague Jane King for the more complex story about nature's role in keeping 1.5 alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for everyone for coming. It's great to see so many people. So I'll just launch straight in. There's quite a lot to get through. The UK is one of the most nationally polluted countries. We are part of nature, and it supplies us with food, water, air, shelter, medicines, and our health and well-being. We're reliant on nature as never before to mitigate climate change by absorbing carbon and adapting to the worst impacts like flooding and drought and extreme heat. And a new report from the Office for Environmental Protection says that vital UK ecosystems are at tipping points already. They name key causes as seabed trawling, pollution of land and rivers from agriculture and sewage, and they're critical of the government's slow progress in the face of the collapse of these ecosystems. The Environment Act has a target to halt decline by 2030, but we don't think that's enough. We believe we must reverse that decline by 2030. The government has an ongoing consultation on this, to halt decline by 2030, seeing a 10% improvement by 2042. But NGOs are warning, though, that without concrete plans to stop decline now, we're on track to worsen considerably by 2030, and that risks pushing ecosystems beyond recovery. Our report looks to an important study on irrecoverable carbon, and there are huge stores of CO2 in the world's critical ecosystems, such as forests, peatlands and wetlands. And if lost, this CO2 would be unrecoverable by 2050. And that would risk accelerating global heating out of control. Biodiversity is the lifeblood of these ecosystems, keeping them healthy and functioning. So we need bold, swift action now. Now, in 2009, the Stockholm Resilience Centre came up with a planetary boundaries framework to measure what's going on in the Earth's natural systems and to assess the danger of safety limits being breached. 7 of these boundaries are now breached, and you'll see that climate change is just one of them, along with biodiversity loss, chemical pollution, phosphorus, nitrogen pollution, freshwater change, and ocean acidification is coming up to being breached, also land use change. The food system has the widest destructive impact on all 7 of these boundaries. We have to eat, but producing food doesn't have to be so destructive. The food system grew exponentially, and most people aren't aware of its impacts. It causes around 20% of the UK's emissions, and that grows to 35% with our imports. We can't afford not to listen to the scientists who are studying this. A recent report shows that even if fossil fuel emissions were eliminated immediately, the impacts of the global food system alone would make it impossible to limit warming to 1.5 and would even threaten 2 degrees. Our report talks about the food system. It's not farmers that drive this or consumer choice. The food industry has driven demand for novelty and shaped our diets. And it's created an unsustainable market in which we're all trapped. That's farmers and consumers and the food industry. The UK food market is huge. It's our biggest manufacturing industry, and it has sophisticated promotional campaigns. Advertising focuses, though, on the wrong things. Just 2.5% of the advertising budget goes on fresh fruit and veg. The food industry recognises the need for change. We've got a quote here that says the UK food strategy cannot be left to the market. You might think that that came from an NGO, but it was actually Tesco that said that, giving evidence to the Environment and Audit Committee recently. They said the only way to change is government policy. to create a level playing field and in consultation with civil society. There's too little space for nature now. The National Food Strategy report that the Government commissioned shows this in this land use map. 70% of the UK is farmland, and the majority you can see here is to raise livestock, not feeding people directly. There's an area, very small area at the top for golf courses, and it's about the same as the area that we use to grow fruit and veg. You see that the built up area is actually very small. And on the right hand side, you can see the amount of land that's being used overseas. It's more than double the UK land area to raise, again, mainly livestock. So we need much more room for ecosystems that store carbon and can protect the climate impacts like flooding and drought, along with biodiversity that keeps them alive and functioning. Ecosystems are a living, breathing web of life. So we've got a quote here from Dr. Paul Behrens, a contributor to the report. He says that adopting a more plant-based diet could give rich nations a double climate dividend by lowering emissions and releasing land for carbon capture. Now, it doesn't mean that we've all got to become vegan, but this would lower emissions from producing the huge amounts of animal feed in the UK and abroad, like soya and palm oil, as well as lowering methane and nitrous oxide. And cutting livestock would release a huge amount of land for carbon capture to restore peat and expand woodland. And we've got some food facts here that I'll go through very quickly. Over 70% of the UK land is farmland, and more than 85% of it is used to produce livestock. That's from the National Food Strategy. And livestock amounts to more than 230 million animals in the UK. That's what we're supporting on our land. Less than 1% of agricultural land is currently used for fruit and vegetable growing. That's down from 45% in 2011. And the UK imports around 50% of its vegetables and 84% of its fruit. So the benefits of this would be manifold. We'd have better food security, we're less reliant on imports, diversifying to increase fruit and vegetables that can feed more people on less land, and we'd have less land for growing monocrops such as wheat and grass that are so susceptible to drought and flooding. We need to safeguard farmers. We must adapt agriculture. You can see on this map here that it shows a map from DEFRA and the Met Office of the increased risk of heat stress in cattle by 2050, and we're looking at over 1,000% in the southwest, over 3,000% in Northern Ireland. These are areas that support a lot of livestock, and these businesses are depending on that. So we must adapt farming. We'd have better public health. More plant-based diet is healthier. Cutting the cost of dietary disease like diabetes to the NHS. We'd be able to boost local economies. Shorter supply chains would supply local food for local people. And we'd be lowering chemical inputs. We'd get cleaner air and water and be able to restore soils. There's a quote here from the National Food Strategy, several quotes, saying that reducing meat consumption is the single most effective lever we can pull. And these are the recommendations that it gave to the government. Increase fruit and vegetables consumption by 30% by 2030 for climate, nature and human health. And growing fruit, vegetables and grains generates around 12 times more calories per hectare than livestock production because we're feeding people directly. So we've got a dedicated section in the report to food system emissions and pollutants. As Simon said before, we need to cut methane quickly, and the UK signed up to the Global Methane Pledge to reduce methane by 30% by 2030. This can buy us time to decarbonise the economy. Ammonia is a big problem. It's a large component of air particle pollution, and 60% of our land is polluted with ammonia, combined with nitrogen and phosphorus pollution from agriculture and combined with pesticides, were creating a cocktail of chemicals polluting land and water. And dying ecosystems stop absorbing carbon and they're beginning to release it. So you can see from this map of water bodies that pollution mainly from agriculture and from sewage and water treatment is affecting all of the surface water bodies in the UK. In England, I should say, sorry. So it's causing them all to fail chemical status. So we must prioritise protecting our carbon sinks and stores. Peatland is the biggest UK carbon store. It stores about 3.2 billion tonnes of CO2, but 80% of UK peatland is degraded, and it's responsible at the moment for about 5% of our emissions. The main cause for this is livestock grazing, burning on shooting estates, and pollution, particularly from ammonia. And we have an England peat action plan at the moment to restore around 20% of peatlands, but the ONS estimates that restoring all peatland would cost around £8 billion, but it would deliver benefits of over £100 billion, outweighing the cost by 5 to 10 times. The UK woodland covers is only 13% compared to around 33% on average in the rest of Europe. Woodland has the highest rates of carbon absorption, but most of our woodland isn't protected. The current government proposal is for 30,000 hectares of new woodland a year, but that would take around 8 years to increase just 1%. Rewilding Britain report suggests that there's potential to create double that area of woodland within 10 years by rapidly freeing up land and focus on natural regeneration and reforestation that has more potential to absorb carbon rather than planting new forests where they haven't been before. So the ocean absorbs and stores more carbon and releases more oxygen than any other ecosystem. And we feel that the net zero strategy should recognise essential links like this between climate and nature. But pollution in our water systems and the ocean and industrial fishing are creating dead zones, making the ocean unable to absorb carbon. A 2021 study shows that trawling the bottom of the ocean releases more CO2 than aviation. And overfishing is a huge risk to the ocean's ability to absorb carbon. As with all ecosystems, biodiversity keeps the ocean alive and functioning as a carbon store, but bottom trawling is going on in 97% of our marine protected areas. In Lyme Bay and Dorset, fish stocks have increased by 430% since trawling and dredging were banned. So finally, our global footprint, it's vital that we account for and reduce our global emissions and ecological footprint. We talked earlier about the global safety net, the ecosystems that contain billions of tons of irrecoverable carbon. Developed nations must act urgently to protect these. And rich nations are using up too much of the world's natural resources, much of that to feed livestock, not people. But 2 billion people don't have access to healthy, nutritious food and safe water. In 2022, the rate of deforestation in the Amazon doubled, and we must recognise our contribution to this through our imports, but also through our banking and financial systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane and Simon. That's for such rich presentations. I know we started a little bit late today and that lots of you have been posting questions, so I'm just going to keep this really, really brief. And I know that predominantly the Ambition Gap report is there to use for you all to use as a tool. It outlines the gap between the direction in which the UK is heading in relation to the science, you know, what is scientifically needed. But we also do include some good news, a way forward. And this is a piece of proposed legislation, the Climate and Ecology Bill, that has been developed with 0 Hour and with the collaboration of many prominent climate and nature scientists, which, if made law, would precisely fill this ambition gap. So it would make sure that policy is following the science and would put in place an urgent integrated plan strong enough to tackle the climate and nature emergencies. So as it says here, it would create an overarching mission statement and give a strong signal to markets and individuals that government is serious. On the next slide, I just sort of outlined some of the key elements of the bill. And while that's there, and do check out our website, which is www.zerohour.uk. I just wanted to mention a call to action for any of you who are interested. We'd be really, really grateful if you could help us share and spread news of this report. We have a tweet, a click to tweet link. There's a post on Facebook that you can share as well. Casper's just shared it in the chat. I'll mention this at the end as well, but in case any of you have to dash, it would be fantastic if you could help share this evening so we can help spread as much as possible. I'm going to pass over now to Oliver, who's been collecting your questions, and we've got just over 15 minutes, I think, for questions.
Great, thanks, Amy. And of course, I probably speak for very many people when we say thank you to Simon and Jane and everyone who's helped with the report. It's really, really useful and really eye-opening, so thank you. We've got lots of questions, but not much time. But we had a very early question from Councillor Tim Eggins from Tatworth and Forton Council in South Somerset, I think. He has said, I listened to a talk by Professor Kevin Anderson of the Tyndall Centre on Saturday. He believes that net zero should be changed to actual zero and that we should be completely off fossil fuels by 2030, that we're presently on a 2.5 to 4 degree trajectory. What are your thoughts on this, please? Simon, Nathalie, Jane.
Thank you, Tim. We work closely with Kevin Anderson, and he has a very good point about net zero. It's being hidden within net zero are all these ludicrous, perhaps isn't too strong a word, assumptions that we can extract CO2 from the atmosphere, and it's being used to allow us to continue to burn fossil fuels. So our bill will push for a transition off fossil fuels as rapidly as possible, and it will not allow technologies to be used which can't be demonstrated to work or which damage nature. One of the things I'd say is that there's been a really exciting study recently from Stanford University where they looked at power grid data from 145 countries down to 30-second granularity, and they modeled 100% renewables without all the nasty stuff like blue hydrogen and the contentious things like nuclear, which may well not be ready in time for when we need to reach net zero. And they were able to demonstrate that by grouping countries into blocks, say all Europe with interconnectors between them, and with demand offsetting, we could get to 100%. And the great news is that the savings are estimated to be over 60% on total energy costs. And although the cost of transition would be quite high, the payback because of those savings would be incredibly fast. They estimate 6 years. Now, even if that's optimistic by a long shot, it looks like we've got a very clear path. We've just got to step out along it.
Thanks, Simon. Nathalie or Jane, would you like to comment?
Sure, I think I would very much agree with Kevin. So the problem with the net zero is that it has a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty in, for example, nature can help you recover by storing carbon, but depending on how it's done and how your restoration project will be affected by climate change, how much carbon will actually be captured in the long term can vary quite a lot. So I think what he probably wants to illustrate here is that the net zero play a bit with the fire, in the sense that the uncertainty can go one and another, and a lot of people see the net zero as an excuse to continue to live as it is and then bring a bit of forest here and there, thinking that this will get them out of the crisis. Going for zero is following the principle of precaution, acknowledging that we know that climate change is driven by fossil fuels. We need to get rid of the dependency of fossil fuels.
Great, thank you, Nathalie. Thank you, Simon. There are two questions here I'd like to group together, and it's possibly something for Amy and Jane to reflect on. Tony Claydon from Felton has asked how we intend to give this report political heft, and how, for instance, this is different from that of the Climate Change Committee. Simon, you may wish to comment on that, but also Bob Maynard from Gosport has asked, and maybe this is linked, maybe it's not, but how do we combat influential net zero detractors? So Amy, Simon?
Yeah, so, Simon, actually, do you want to kick off? And I'll add in a bit about the bill afterwards as well.
Well, I'll just answer on how it's different to a report from the Climate Change Committee. The Climate Change Committee has a difficult path to steer, and to some degree, it certainly looks, when you dig deep down into their reports, that they've had to make some assessment as to what's realistic to ask for, rather than simply making their recommendations purely on the science. I think they've had to consider what's politically realistic to deliver. Now, since they produced their carbon budget, everything's changed. Impacts are coming upon us much more quickly, and I think the public are now far more ready to accept the sort of transformative changes needed to genuinely keep to 1.5, and that's what we're trying to focus on. We're simply reporting the science, and we're not getting caught up in what's politically acceptable or not. We're totally independent. We're not appointed by anyone. We're not funded. We're only funded by small donations.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think this is it, isn't it? Is that the Climate and Ecology Bill really is a translation of the latest science. So it really, what this report does is to demonstrate what the gap is between that latest science and the direction we're going in now. So a lot of MPs, for example, and politicians who we speak to, I think there's a lot of belief that we are doing enough. And I know that the UK has been world leading. So it's really important that actually we understand the distance that we do need to go so that we can create the policy required. And like I said, the Climate and Ecology Bill does just that. And this report is kind of a case for that. So whether it's, for example, doing everything we can for 1.5, going further than the 50% chance that the CCC gives us now, obviously we know we can go a lot further than that. As Jane said, we're one of the, I think we're the 7th most nature depleted countries in the world. If we halt where we're at now, that's definitely not going far enough. And there's a lot of call ahead of COP15, the UN Biodiversity Summit, for us to halt and reverse nature, the global goal for nature. So this is what the report and the bill both call for as well, is just to reach up to the most up-to-date science.
Okay, great. We can get through some more questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. So the next question is from Orion. I hope I've said that right. Hawker from South Somerset. Is there a truly independent report that shows how retrofitting insulation across all housing stock will result in net reduction of energy use, taking into account the emissions involved in manufacturing, transport and labour? Simon, you covered housing and retrofitting. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'd say just briefly on that, the Climate Change Committee have mapped out all the emissions to net zero, and they take life cycle emissions like that into account, and they've calculated that it is possible to achieve and it delivers savings. And then there's an organisation, a collaboration between Oxford and Leeds University called CREDS, which is worth checking out, and they've modelled a pathway to net zero, looking at emissions from all those sort of things. Will the operation of wind turbines outweigh the carbon cost of manufacture? And these things are very positive yeses. So yes, that has been done. So you could check out the Climate Change Committee and CREDS for that.
Great, thank you, Simon. It'd be interesting now to draw in Jane and Nathalie. There are a couple of comments, quite a few comments about the lack of action from COP26. There's also COP27 on the horizon, and the unfortunately much less promoted COP15 Biodiversity Conference that is also very central to this discussion. What can we do about the wealthy and powerful individuals, asks Susan Thorne, who trot out their green credentials at high-profile events like COP26, but whose lifestyles cause the most problems for climate and nature. Jane, would you like to kick that one off?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. I think we very much feel at 0 Hour that the COP isn't designed well, and the COPs are not joined up. So we've got COP26, we have COP26, we're just about to have COP27. We've got COP15 coming up, which almost no one's heard of, and that is to address biodiversity loss. But we really need, there is within the COPs, the Conference of the Parties at the UN, there is an attempt to join these interests together and have action and have policies coming out of them that are joined up. But it's not very well formed, and you know, there's not very much talk. There wasn't very much talk at COP26 about the role of nature. Obviously, they were saying that we've got to stop declining biodiversity, but they don't go into enough detail about what that means. I don't know if you've got anything more to say on that, Nathalie.
Oh, thanks.
I think the thing to understand is that when those UN conventions were created, the problems were seen as very independent. So they thought about climate, then they thought about biodiversity, then they thought about desertification, then they thought about water. And this created different UN conventions with completely different setting and way of operating. Now, the relationship between climate and biodiversity hasn't been really discussed until quite recently. And the Climate Convention has always focused on carbon because they early on built a huge scientific panel to really show the science in terms of what creates climate change, how do you address it, what are the different scenarios, and how do you stop it. With biodiversity, it's a much more difficult thing. It's not, you don't have something that is just like carbon. Biodiversity is a lot of things. It's about species, it's about populations, it's about diversity, it's about ecosystem. So it's very difficult to reduce it to one metric. On top of that, our ability to predict how biodiversity will fare under a different scenario is much, much less developed. And that's because that UN Convention on Biodiversity took much more time to actually create a scientific panel. It was much, much later, the order of 15 years later than the IPCC and the Climate Change Convention. So the biodiversity has a lot of disadvantages. It started later, it has less political traction, and it's less well understood. And on top of that, until recently, no one really thought about the relationship between biodiversity and climate. And that explains why you have so much difference in the political impetus to do something about it. I would temper what you said by saying, actually, the UNFCCC, so the Climate Convention, acknowledging that nature has a role was a big win at the COP26. Before Glasgow, you would never see any nature NGO going to a UN Convention on Climate. Now you have a huge representation and which huge enthusiasm to try to get those climate negotiators to think about climate. But those people have never thought about biodiversity before, so it's going to be taking a bit of time. But I think we're on the right path.
Thank you, Nathalie. I think possibly at this point, Claire Hunt's question, Claire from Worthing, has something that maybe Amy can talk to as part of perhaps pulling some of these strings together. Amy, what's next for 0 Hour and the Climate and Ecology Bill campaign and its progress through Parliament?
Thanks, Oliver, and thanks, Claire. Oh, a nice one to end on. So, I mean, some of you might know that the bill has been passing through the House of Lords. So we had a debate with full cross-party support. We had a Conservative Baroness Hooper come and speak in support of the bill. So that was really, really fantastic. So we're going to keep pushing the bill through the Lords. It will have a committee stage in October and then it will pass through into the Commons. So we're really excited. We can really kind of feel the traction that it's getting now and the increasing support. And, you know, that only happens with the support of a lot of you here today and others who couldn't make it. So do keep writing to your MPs, letting your friends and family know about the bill and spreading word on this report as well. And shall I just re-mention that call to action, Oliver, or is there something else to
No,
add
that
in
would be
the
useful.
questions? Fantastic. Yeah, so it just leaves me with, I think, 2 minutes to go to thank everyone so much again for coming, to thank Jane, Simon, Natalie and Oliver as well, and everyone who's been helping in the background too. We're going to post now our call to action again. We'd be really grateful if you could help spread the word. You know, I think we see this report as a really practical tool. It's really to make sure that we as the UK are going in the right direction. We can use that to help push the bill, which is a plan to be able to tackle the crises. So yeah, we'd be really grateful. Share on Twitter, share on Facebook, take a few minutes before you put the tea on. That would be really, really great. So thank you all. And we'll be in touch as well with a recording of today's events.
Thanks, Amy. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.